Hey, I'm just going to start this off with a brief announcement that I'm going to be switching these videos to monthly instead of weekly. When I first set this goal for myself, I didn't really have anything envisioned for how long I was going to do it for, and I've done it for almost 9 months. At this point, I've become a full-time student in multimedia, and I'm starting to do some paid work in that field, so a lot of both the purpose for why I was doing this so frequently and the energy that I had to do it are changing a lot, and I know this has been reflected in the quality of this content, and I also have a lot less time to make it, so it'll make my life easier and I hope give other folks who are still watching this something a little more entertaining. But I am going to finish my series on Avowed because I committed and I'm stubborn and I want to finish it for myself, even if very few people are watching it. Thank you if you are, though. This was going to be a longer video because I was super fascinated by thinking about this project, but I think really there's mostly two things I want to say in this that I'm going to try and get through pretty quickly. I'm going to do a little bit of review, but really I don't know that this will make all that much sense if you didn't watch the other two videos, which I'll link at the top of the description. But generally, want to reiterate, my main thesis is that Avowed has a lot of problems that stem from it attempting to court disengaged or otherwise uncommitted gamers, either because of Xbox Game Pass or because of changes in attention span as time has gone along. But there are two exceptions to that that really stuck with me. The first is the big decision that changes the story the most in Act 2. The act takes place in Fior Mesa Verno, a enclave of animancers who are a sort of mad scientist that studies the magic of souls. The practice is banned in Adir, so they aren't really thrilled with the Empire's spreading its influence to places like Paradise. However, there's a lot of anger of non-animancers in the area because while the animancer magic used to ensure huge crop yields that kept everyone fed and wealthy as it was exporting to the rest of the continent, the crops have now dried up and fingers are starting to point toward the people who took credit originally. Eventually, you investigate the disappearances of some high-ranking rangers. These are members of the area's military. There's suspicion among the ranks that someone sold out their comrades for money from local bandits. And when you rescue a ranger from some of the same bandits, you find a note saying that yes, that's the case, someone was getting money from them. But when you finally track down the traitor, this turns out to not be her original motivation. She's knocking off anti-AD or seniors in the military in the hopes that she can facilitate an Adiran invasion that is met with minimal bloodshed. From her perspective, the influence of Adir and the Steel Garrote will force out the animancers, allow the crops to get better, and the cost of a few of her comrades is worth it if it reduces the amount of deaths from a protracted conflict. It's a motivation rooted firmly in a thorough understanding of the lore and location rather than a cliched turn the other cheek decision like the one in Act 1. It's also the rare scene where a villain explains her entire plan that actually works. From her perspective, talking to you as the envoy of the Empire of Adir, she's basically revealing she's on your side. The question then becomes whether you buy her argument or let your loyalty to Adir win out over your larger commitments to morality. If you side with her or otherwise don't wipe out the secret garrison of Garrote soldiers nearby, Fior will be completely destroyed, which does somewhat weaken her convictions in hindsight if they're just going to flatten it anyway, but it isn't surprising if you understand what the Garrote are. If you wipe out the garrison, the attack will still happen, but it will be ultimately unsuccessful. The thing that makes the decision even more incredible, though, is that even being the most pivotal choice in Act 2, it's actually far off the critical path. This quest is not a main quest, it's a side quest, and the most complicated one. If someone isn't completing their quest log or doesn't even find it in the first place before advancing past a certain milestone in the main story, it'll trigger without your input. Keeping with my thesis that some of the bad parts of the game come from pandering to the least engaged gamer, I think it supports that thesis that this amount of complication and understanding was there with the knowledge that anyone finding it was somebody who was really invested and trying to see everything in the game rather than rush through it. The percent of people who have gotten the achievement for finding and destroying this garrison is about half that of the people that have made it that far in the game in general, which is a pretty dramatic difference even if some subset of the people that didn't destroy the garrison knew about it but just chose the evil path. It's also an intersection of optional and mainline content that I don't think I've encountered in a AAA game outside of the Witcher series and maybe even the first Witcher game. Carrie Patel said that the favorite part of her game was some optional thing like this. I wonder whether this moment was what she was talking about, but she could also be referring to the fact that Fior's previous leader had disappeared at some point in the past, and it would remain a mystery for you unless you're really thorough and complete the area's most difficult scavenger hunt quest where you happen upon his corpse. Unfortunately, I don't think that Act 3 and 4 decisions are as good as the one in Act 2, when they're the kind of thing that everyone is going to encounter. Act 3's feels like a game show type of choice, and Act 4's has that unfortunate pattern of a villain who makes good societal critiques but then does something so cartoonishly evil level that it totally undermines that. Fortunately, the final act, a kind of mini-map fifth area, is a lot more interesting in the way that it wraps up the central mystery of the game, who the presence in the main character's head is, and how they relate to the plague you were sent to investigate in the first place. It turns a cliche chosen one story into something unique while also paying off a lot of your companion relationships. You learn that the voice in your head is Sapidal, a new and young god that was undiscovered by many of the authority figures in the world. You're also there godlike, solving the mystery of where your mysterious godlike features come from. You learn that several centuries in the past, some earlier incarnation of the Steel Garrote, another military force for Wodaka, the goddess of law, order, and fascism, invaded the island to kill Sapidal. Being a young god of the continent, Sapidal had no strong conception of the difference between themselves and the living beings in their domain. Afraid for their life, they exerted their force against Wodaka the way that one might move fingers. Unfortunately, this manifested as what would now be called the Dream Scourge, warping living beings to do what was needed to cast out the invader. Sapidal survived the war, but was imprisoned, largely diminishing their reach. When in the present day, Wodaka is trying again to reach Sapidal through the Garrote, this awoke Sapidal and caused them to lash out in the same way, leading to another outbreak of the Dream Scourge. The player-character relationship with Sapidal appears as fitting into a traditional cliché chosen one narrative, but the interesting twist is where Sapidal isn't this broad, all-knowing figure. They're much more like a toddler, and the disease you're trying to combat is much less of a natural disaster than a malfunctioning autoimmune response. You talk directly with Sapidal throughout the entire game, but I found the interactions at the end here in the reality-bending prison Sapidal is trapped in to be the most satisfying, because things happen through your companions rather than yourself. Games with silent protagonists, I think, can get really annoying when they buy too hard into the all-importance of the protagonist, because you don't really have the same kind of relationship with that character since they're not being acted by anyone, they're just kind of an avatar for you experiencing the game. And it's smart here that the end focuses on the emotions coming from your companions rather than some idea of you being the most awesome figure in the universe. The most relevant is Giada. You meet her in Fior in Act 2 and learn that she lost her parents at a pretty young age. At one point, they locked themselves away in their laboratory, hyperfixating on an experiment that eventually malfunctioned and turned them into plant people, kind of like in Annihilation. Finding this laboratory in the mid-game is a nice character moment because while Giada won't enter the lab herself, instead sending you to go find something for her, the fact that she reveals this to you at all puts her into contrast with Kai and Marius, who are pretty opaque with their past. This descent to the lab is good foreshadowing for every character's development, as both Kai and Marius join Giada in that openness. What Giada learns in the endgame is that her parents' soul experiments eventually allowed them to reach into Sapidal's cage, the first living beings to do so in centuries. The Touch-Starred Sapidal embraced them with all their force, and unfortunately, this twisted them and their souls into what we find in the laboratory. Giada's reaction to this is really revealing. She takes this with pain, but rapid forgiveness. The role of an Animancer is one of curiosity and accepting things bigger than yourself. Having played a little bit of Pillars of Eternity after Avowed, I'm a bit disappointed that some of the more macabre realities of Animancy didn't make it into Avowed, with this later game erring more on the side of scientific excellency, wackiness, or at the worst, a sort of goop Joe Rogan hucksterism. But this moment with Giada captures their essence well. She has moments where her willingness to embrace the terrifying depths of magic frustrate her companions, but it speaks something of her that she's willing to accept that sometimes that means herself or the ones she loves are the ones that are going to have to pay the price. Kai, who has not been my favorite because I think he's both too flat and falls into this killer with a heart of gold trope. His whole storyline revolves around guilt for a friend who was mortally wounded trying to save Kai. Kai left this friend at his deathbed because he couldn't face losing him. It's fine, but it was nothing that struck me as particularly new to this game, and it felt entirely wrapped up and played out by the time that Act 3 was over. There's acknowledgement of this repetition when Sapidal shows Kai this friend lying on his deathbed, but there's also something new because it's Kai realizing that he's been so focused on the guilt of him leaving him when he was dying that Kai is getting to remember again that this person was so many other things throughout his life and that it's unfair both to himself and to his friend, to remember him only as someone dying. Yatzli, the other animesser in your party, also doesn't seem like she needs anything. She's much older than even Kai and has a ton of self-confidence. She was my and a lot of people's favorite companion in the game because while Kai feels like Garrus, Marius is the generic irritable dwarf Gimli type thing, at least by some stretch, and Giada shares a bunch of outspoken muckraker traits with a lot of characters. The one that comes the most to mind is Piper from Fallout 4, down to her introduction arguing with the town mayor. But Yatzli, at least if she doesn't rub the player the wrong way, is pretty unique to Avowed. But a kind of effervescent, older Elle Woods character is something that I haven't seen a lot before. She doesn't have a coming of age to do or something particular to grapple with, but she gets to meet a past version of herself who was a scribe for this long forgotten people that she's dedicated her life to studying. It's a cool bit of discovery for a character that the game understands already knew herself pretty well. And finally, Marius' story is one I feared was going to be like Kai's, but managed to subvert expectations in Act 4 by being way more messed up than I would have possibly predicted. If there's one criticism I would levy at this game that I don't know that can be offloaded into my larger systemic explanation, it's that a lot of it feels very Saturday morning cartoony. So I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about Marius' storyline, where you learn he was the survivor of a large ritualistic cult suicide, something that he has since blocked out, and no one who knew him when he was that young have informed him about it, leaving him with emotions similar to Sapidol that he hasn't really matured enough to handle because he wasn't really given the opportunity to process. It's a heavy thread in Act 4, and it does get pretty well resolved, as is the pattern with all of these, but it's still a touching moment where he gets one more goodbye with the friend that had in the past rescued him from this fate. What's new in this interaction with Marius and all the other companion interactions is that they're given by Sapidol in a sort of acknowledgement that these members of your party are individual human beings, not the god's own limbs it can strain to fight off invaders at its own whim. You're watching this incredibly dangerous god learn to understand the world enough to not repeat the same destructive Dream Scourge mistakes in the future. And it's demonstrating that through interactions with the characters that you know the best. They're ultimately all optional interactions that if you're just zipping through to get to the end, you can entirely skip, so it's still accessible to the half-paying attention gamer. When you finally reach Sapidol and are given the choice of whether to kill them or set them free from their prison, it's a hard one because you've seen throughout the game all of the destruction wrought by some of their actions. But I think that this taught me well enough where that was coming from and led to this not acceptance of an all-powerful god as deserving to preside over the island, but more of accepting that these independent city-states and good people that existed there should get to control their own destiny and make their own mistakes, rather than be subject to a god that would be happy to kill all of them if it meant there was less chaos. Unfortunately, this isn't the note the game ends on. There's a far more comprehensive wrapping up of every plot thread with a final battle for the freedom or subjugation of the living lands, depending on which side you choose. But this is the note that was the most satisfying for me, so it's the last one I'm going to talk about. And that's all I have to say on this. I don't really know who this was for beyond myself. I played a lot of this game and found some things really interesting, and I had a lot of good time talking about it. I really need a break on Fridays because it's turned into my day that I rush to get a video out, and then I have made the stupid decision of having a class on Saturdays. So it'll be really nice going forward for a little while to have another day off in the weekend to catch my breath. Thank you for anyone who makes it to this point in the video, and I will see you sometime before the end of June.